Hello, everybody. This is Lara Coutinho Dean, and in the SCA, I'm known as Dame Sophia the Orange. And today we are doing a video with my very good friend, Meriorie Matheson. That's her SCA name. And Shayna Wooldridge is her real name, and she's a Shakespeare geek like me. And she knows more stuff about some topics than I do. And so I've invited her here to do a little video sharing what she knows about things about the culture that Shakespeare operated in back in history. And this is all in support of a wonderful production of Taming of the Shrew that is happening on April 13th in partnership with the Canton of Elvegast, a little SCA group in Raleigh, North Carolina. And we're partnering with the Scrap Paper Shakespeare Company. So this is to give you a little historic context about what's going on, because, you know, Shakespeare was not the same as the rest of us 400 years later. What was he? There were things that were different. And in Taming of the Shrew, a lot of those come out, like the culture of men owning women. They believed they owned women. They could abuse women. And in Taming of the Shrew, we see some domestic abuse that would nowadays be illegal. Uh, so let's not do that. We're not going to do that. We're going to teach. We're going to educate and show people that the culture was different back then, and this is how. So, Meriorie, thank you for being here. I've been really just so excited to see you teach whenever I get the opportunity. And for the sake of the world listening, I've been friends with Meriorie for many years, and she teaches great stuff from the performing arts perspective. She's a great performer herself, and she's been teaching classes at Atlantia University and other places in the SCA around performing arts, theater, history of theater, and all sorts of great stuff. So I'm going to hand it over to Meriorie. And so please introduce yourself and tell the audience a little bit more about yourself. Thank you, hon.
Hello. Yes, I am Meriorie Matheson in the SCA, and I started out with theater actually in college. I have a history degree with a classics minor from the University of Randolph in Lynchburg, Virginia. And uh, basically, I studied theater as like my focus for my history degree with the classics minor. The Randolph College, they host a yearly symposium on theater history, actually, with their focus being on early theater history, and it's a fun experience. They put on a Greek play, and it's fun, but I have been in the SCA for the last 13 years, and I brought a lot of my enthusiasm for theater with me from my experience at Randolph into the SCA. I've been, like you said, teaching classes at university and encouraging performing arts wherever I can. And I guess I'll go ahead and get started with
Yeah.
the
Yeah, go
theater
ahead and dive
history.
in. Go ahead and dive in. Hopefully, everyone's tracking that you really know what you're talking about, and you've got some good sources, and you're sharing what you know. And I'm so pleased. Thank you.
So, through the reign of Henry VIII, theater in England was predominantly made up of small groups of performers who were later titled vagabonds, who wandered from town to town staging performances mostly on the backs of wagons or in inn courtyards. It originally grew up around festivals and things from morality plays and scenes from the Bible. These performances were most often religious in nature, and this Catholic religiosity was considered distasteful after Henry VIII's Protestant Reformation. Um, so they began secularizing through the universities originally. They started imitating some of the ancient Greek plays, and their imitations grew into unique theater productions. Well, yeah, it's a little hard to call them productions because they would have been like small, like classroom performances and that sort of thing originally. But this trend of secularization in response to the Reformation continued into the reign of Elizabeth I, when the vagabond theater troupes were banned, actually. The only players permitted were those who had secured noble or royal patronage to form official theater troupes. These troupes still wandered to perform when not performing for their patrons until in 1576, the first theater was built in Shoreditch, which is a small suburb outside of London, by James Burbage, who was a later colleague of William Shakespeare. More theaters grew up in this suburb, which was considered a disreputable area of London. It was outside the jurisdiction of the London Common Council, so a lot of places like gambling dens, brothels, and bear baiting arenas grew up along in the same area. And this, combined with the more secular nature of the plays, led to them gaining a reputation as being immoral, and probably contributed to later heavy sanctions against them. Queen Elizabeth I, though, and her successors James I and Charles I were enthusiastic patrons of the arts in general and performance in particular. Elizabeth especially adored masks and plays. Originally, her performers for her plays were doing just morality plays and things in court. They were courtiers and they were amateurs. They were not being paid for their performances or anything like that. Um, but over time, the courtiers began being patrons of professional acting troupes, the vagabonds that originally had grown up over time, and these performing troupes began performing for the royal court and gaining a lot of renown. Um, It spread to the nobility, where it became fashionable to sponsor theater troupes in order to curry favor with Her Majesty. And the official stance of the troops was that the public theaters were merely rehearsals for their court performances, despite the fact that public theaters earned them the lion's share of their incomes. And this stance actually allowed the theaters to skirt bans on public performances because the London Common Council did not like the theater. They did not like the immoral nature of the plays. They believed them to encourage, immoral behavior among the public, that sort of thing. So they tried to ban them as often as they could, and there was like a widespread ban throughout England for a while that Queen Elizabeth officially skirted herself by decreeing that these rehearsals, quote unquote, were not subject to the bans and they could be held, as frequently as needed in order to prepare for royal court performances. And of course, the public was allowed to attend these rehearsals. So, the nobles started commissioning private theaters, beginning with what is known as the Blackfriars Theatre, and spreading to several others in London. And I'm just going to put in a shameless plug. Actually, there's a Blackfriars Theatre in Virginia that is a recreation of the original Blackfriars. I've attended performances there. They are fabulous people. It's the National Shakespeare Association or Society. It, they are amazing performers. Go see a play. Anyway, um, but they grew up. They spread to several other similar theaters, like the Whitefriars and the Cockpit, and several others in London, where they could watch plays in a similar manner to the public, but without having to mingle with the rabble. These private theaters also had the benefit of being fully indoors, unlike the massive outdoor public theaters beginning in Shoreditch. Officially, the theaters were subject to the whims of an individual known as the Master of Revels, who had to approve plays word for word before they could be performed. Um, in reality, he was very flexible. As long as the plays didn't criticize the monarchy and things like that, he was generally okay with them, and he didn't really pay that much attention to like minute changes in text. That's why there's a couple of different folios of Shakespeare's work, a couple of different versions of Shakespeare's work that survive, where there are wording differences between the plays. Um, in addition, there were repeated closures of the theater due to plague and civil unrest. These restrictions and closures influenced the playwrights significantly. They wrote out of necessity plays that were likely to win the approval of the master of revels as well as their noble patrons. So, political material favorable to the current regime and critical of antagonistic predecessors became common, as well as material that was, highly entertaining. They wanted to make people laugh, they wanted to make people cry, but they also wanted to have a certain flavor of the plays so that they would win the approval of their noble patrons. So they didn't put in critical material, that sort of thing. Um, uh, so you see this in Shakespeare's plays, for example, critical of antagonistic predecessors of the royal family, for example, became really common. So Richard III, for example, was an enemy of the early Tudor monarchs, and he was portrayed as a monstrously villainous character. And it was portrayed that the Tudor monarchy saved England from his tyranny. Um, and this lean into the approval of the nobility and the monarchy ran counter to the approval of the wider populace. Over time, new plays were performed almost exclusively for the upper classes in the private theaters, while the lower classes contented themselves with old favorites that catered to their tastes, like Shakespeare and Marlowe. It also contributed to the eventual total shutdown of the theaters with the rise of the Puritans under Oliver Cromwell, bringing about the end of the English Renaissance, but that's a little bit outside the scope of our period.
Wow, I gotta just interrupt you long enough to say that when you share these things with me, it really fits all these other bits and pieces that I've heard about what life is like for Shakespeare, his players. Um, I only really learned the name Burbage when I watched Shakespeare in Love. Great movie. But then I realized, based on that character is based on a real person in history that did a lot of production. And, I find these people fascinating. So thank you. That's just my interruption.
So, socially speaking, the climate of Shakespeare was such that, like you were saying earlier with the Taming of the Shrew, like women were considered property. They were the property of their fathers or brothers, whoever in their family until they married, and then they became the property of their husbands. That leans into the Taming of the Shrew significantly. Um, and like you said, domestic abuse was common. It would have been considered funny, like it was in the Taming of the Shrew, unfortunately. There was also a lot of other what we consider minority classes that would have been uh, vilified, like in other plays of Shakespeare, the Jews or the Moors, as they called Black people, would have been they were horribly vilified, and they were generally speaking treated like less than people, even less than human. And it was very common in Shakespearean plays to reflect, the way that most people thought about minorities at the time. Unfortunate as it was, the Jews, for example, were, feared in much of Europe at the time, or they were ostracized completely, even exiled from parts of Europe. Um, and uh, similar situations. The lower classes were considered uneducated. They were often portrayed in the plays as bumbling, foolish, clownish characters. Um, and the upper classes were, of course, noble and regal and beautiful, and they this was funny for most of the earlier plays. It was not as obvious. In the later plays, the further you get into the reign of like James the First, for example, when James the First, he was a more of a patron of the arts even than Elizabeth, and it actually was to the detriment of his reign, and it created a lot of civil unrest because a lot of like historically speaking, we think of like the French as being very like over the top, and their court, like before the French Revolution, was ridiculously opulent. Well, James the First was very much the same way, and it led to civil unrest. and his patronage of the arts. It was reflected in the plays of the time because the common people became more and more foolish and it became more and more ridiculous. And so the plays weren't liked by the general populace. I can't imagine that I would enjoy a play that made fun of me. Um, and this was actually counter to some of the other political climates in which theater grew in Europe, because theater was frequently critical of the ruling classes. That's one of the ways that make people laugh is you make fun of political situations that are going on at the time, and that did happen in the Shakespearean plays, but not anywhere near as commonly as it did in other areas like France and Italy, because like the Shakespearean playwrights depended so heavily on their noble patrons.
Putting all of that beautiful stuff into context of the Taming of the Shrew. So, Taming of the Shrew was written 1590 something. So, Queen Elizabeth the First is old at this point.
Yes.
She's rather old,
Yeah.
and she's not getting around very much. And so she would be bringing troops of actors to her
Hmm.
to perform, and they would be having their rehearsals in theaters. So, can you sort of show me a bit of like imagine what it would be like if, let's say, I'm an average Londoner and maybe I wash clothes for a living and I get the opportunity to go see one of these plays in London. What theater would I be going to? What like is it an outdoor theater or is it that Blackfriars one? And like what's the political climate at this point? Are we looking at um, the time where uh, the lower classes, like me, I mean, maybe I could read, maybe not. Maybe the lower classes are being made fun of a lot, or how much. And so, what kind of climate am I going into politically, socially, knowing that Queen Elizabeth is still on the throne, but she's very, very old, and I'm an average working person um, going in to see this play in London.
So for an average person going to see a play, a commoner like a laundress or something like that, they it would be probably done on a holiday or a day that they didn't have work,
Aha.
because it's kind of an all day affair, or at the very least a
Mm.
half a day, depending on the play, and depending on the event. Y It would be a very social event. You would take a day off and you would go to Shoreditch and you would go to a bear baiting in the morning, or for example,
Mm.
and then a play in the afternoon.
Mhm.
Um, because the plays were in the outdoor theaters. The private theaters would have been exclusively for the upper classes and the nobility, even at this time. And the private theaters actually, during the time of the Taming of the Shrew, weren't as commonly used. They didn't really become much more common until 1599 is when the Blackfriars started operating regularly.
Oh, I see.
Um,
Okay. And that's
so
later than The Taming of the Shrew was published.
yeah,
I mean,
I
I want to
believe
say it was
so.
1590-ish. Don't remember off the top of my head exactly, and these things are fuzzy anyways. Um,
Um,
so yeah.
so the Taming of the Shrew. So for an average person going to see the Taming of the Shrew, they would pay their copper penny or halfpenny to get into the theater, depending on where they were situated in the theater, depending on how much it would cost. You
Mhm.
had your groundlings, who would be people that would be on the floor of the theater, directly in front of the stage, and those were the
Standing,
poorest
right?
seats. Yeah.
Yeah, sit there. They weren't really seats even. You stand,
Yeah, they
right?
would be standing right in front of the stage, and they would
Yeah.
be the hecklers, the people who would be, throwing things at the actors and things like that.
I
They,
would
they would,
definitely be heckling.
and these were the people who were the poorest of the poor
Mm.
coming into
Mhm.
the theater. They would be scraping and saving up their allowances in order to even afford it, just the groundling seats, basically the seats, but the standing positions, and it was packed. You would pack people in. The the Globe Theater, the most famous one that we have extant that's still around today. Um, it holds up to at its height, it held up to 3,000 people at one time, and that was
You're
the
kidding.
seats around the area and also the groundlings on the ground.
Wow. 3,000 people.
And
That's huge.
yeah, and it's ridiculous amount of people, really, if you think about it. And they would have been packed in at the ground level, absolutely packed in. And
Wow.
that's probably the only way that they could get the full 3,000 in.
Yeah.
Um, but the seating around the outside of the theater, and of course, it was open to the sky, so they would have to do this on a day when the weather was nice, and
Mm,
it would have to be during the daytime because otherwise you wouldn't be able to see the actors on the stage. They weren't The
mhm,
stage wasn't lit at all. Um, and uh, so these people would come in. There would be people selling, I guess concessions, we would call it nowadays, but like peanuts and things like that,
mhm.
snacks.
Yeah.
And they would sit in the seats around the edge of the theater, or they would stand in the midsection, and they would watch the play for however long it ran. And the play, the players themselves probably would have spoken the way that we do now at a normal pace. The way that most people perform Shakespeare nowadays is slow because the language is different from our own language. Like it's similar enough that we understand it, but it's different enough that we have to slow it down for a modern audience in order for most of it to
Mhm.
come across.
Mm,
Um, or at least that's what most people do. You
mhm,
don't have to slow it down, and in fact, at the Blackfriars Theater here in Virginia, they don't they speak it conversationally, and trust me when I say it's pretty easy to follow along, generally
oh,
speaking, because of context clues. So even if there's a word or two that you don't understand, or
mhm,
a particular form of phrasing that you don't understand, you'll pick up on it pretty quickly, just because of everything else that's going on. It still
mm,
makes sense. But plays they wouldn't last as long as they do nowadays if they're done word for word. Plays nowadays, the way that Shakespeare plays run, they run hours and hours long because of the way that we tend to slow Shakespeare down. But
oh,
in the moment, they wouldn't have lasted that long, but they still would have been, a couple of hours, and people would have had the longer attention spans for that kind of performance at the time. So they would have been sitting or standing in the theater
uh-huh,
for a couple of hours during the performance of the play, and they would have, just like a movie. You go see a movie nowadays, you
yeah,
sit for a couple of hours in the theater, and then you leave and you talk about it with your friends and you tell everybody about it. Oh my God,
yeah,
go see this movie. It's very similar back then.
yeah,
Oh my God, go
mm,
see this play. Shakespeare's got a new play out. You have to see
yeah.
it. It's amazing. It's hilarious.
So let
Um,
me ask you one thing about the timing.
mhm.
This particular production of Taming of the Shrew we're doing with Scrap Paper Shakespeare. The director is amazing, Emma Zuba. I love working with her. And one of the things she does really well is she edits down Shakespeare's original from the first folio down to something a little shorter that I think makes it a little more digestible by a modern audience. And that's one of the reasons why we partnered with the SCA because SCA events tend to have lots and lots of stuff, lots of activities happening. And so sitting there for a 3 hour play in the middle of an SCA event hasn't been comfortable. So Emma boiled it down to a 90-minute version. So if you're saying, so if I understand correctly, you're saying that the historic truth of how long it would be would maybe be somewhere around 2.5 hours. And so what we're doing in squishing it down a little bit is only a little bit. It's a small adjustment rather than this huge, like taking out half of Shakespeare's words. Um, what do you think?
A lot of people do edit down Shakespeare
Mhm,
to remove what they consider extraneous information or words that people don't understand. They try to rearrange it so that it is more digestible to a modern audience
mhm,
because,
mhm.
quite frankly, modern audiences' attention spans are not that long. Um, we have trouble following anything that lasts over 2 hours.
Yeah.
back then that wouldn't have been so much of a problem, but also they would have been speaking conversationally much faster than most
Mm,
people perform Shakespeare nowadays.
mm,
To be
mm,
or not to be would have been much more
mm.
like to be or not to be, like just like
Yeah.
normal talking.
Mhm.
And
Mm,
so yes, in a
mm,
way, the cutting down of Shakespeare is a bit more loyal to the traditional performance. Um, it can be done a couple of different ways.
mm,
You can either cut the words themselves down to condense
mhm,
the performance, or you can speak faster if you think your audience can keep up. And some plays lend themselves more to that than others. The comedies, for example, are
mm,
much easier to follow at a faster
mm,
clip than the
mhm,
histories.
mm,
Um, and
mhm,
that's speaking from someone who can read Shakespeare conversationally. Like I have no problems following most of Shakespeare when it's being
mhm,
performed at speed.
mhm,
But at the same time, a lot of people do struggle with the word structure and some of the weirder tenses and things that they would have used.
mhm.
So yeah, it would be much more loyal to the play to cut it down a bit.
Cool. Well, I'm glad to know that what we're doing is a small adjustment, because we do that a lot in the SCA. We take what was historically accurate, we adjust it a little bit. We use sewing machines instead of hand sewing sometimes in order to make, clothing that's a historic reenactment. So, doing these things in order to bring history to life is something I like to encourage. So, it's really good to know. Thank you. I love that. The crux of of the crux of Taming of the Shrew that makes it difficult for producing in the modern day without all this extra context is the abuse that we see Petruchio um, putting on Catherine, and sometimes the father Baptista, um, treats Catherine poorly, and she fights back against that. Um, well, what we're trying to do with this production is at least show and demonstrate this is what it was, because we also love some of the characters. They're fun and juicy from an actor point of view, and um, the story is interesting. And to look at it as this is the truth of what happened 400 years ago, we think is worth looking at. What do you think is the value in producing Taming of the Shrew nowadays? And what would you want people to know about our 400-year gap of social and political understanding of the culture?
I think the Taming of the Shrew shows Shakespeare's unique ability to really get into the head of a female character, because it really does show Catherine enduring so much from everyone around her. She's enduring these abuses, and she's reacting in a way that a lot of more modern women may react, is like, how dare you do this stuff to me, I'm going to fight back. And we don't know for sure how unique she would have been, because we couldn't possibly have know the average mindset of a person back then, but we know, legally speaking, everything that was done to her was perfectly legal, everything was allowed, everything would have been maybe a little bit extreme for the time, but it wouldn't have been outside the realm of possibility. Everyone would have known somebody who was treated like Catherine, but they may not have known somebody who reacted like Catherine, because it would have been frowned upon at the time to react in the way that she did. And that's one of the reasons why she's such a unique and interesting character, is because she would have been considered contrary to the norm. Um, so she was entertaining and she was funny
Mm,
because she was different. It inverted expectations. Um,
inverted
so
expectations.
and that's very common in a lot of early Greek plays, like Lysistrata, for example. Lysistrata was not a common Greek woman, and that sort of thing. So that's the real value that I see in Shakespeare's writing and reading a lot of Shakespeare's plays, even the ones that are not as politically accepted nowadays, like Taming of the Shrew, because it really does show Shakespeare's ability to empathize with a female character, which it would have been really weird for a guy at the time to be able to look at the abuse that a woman suffered and go, you know what, that's not okay, because it was so widely accepted.
Mm, beautiful. Alrighty, well, let's wrap this chat up. Thank you so much, Meriorie.
Thank you for having me.